So firstly, I would like to thank the Breakthrough T1D team for inviting me to come to Brisbane today to speak and share my story. Breakthrough T1D have been incredibly supportive of my journey so far, and I want to thank them for all of their hard work. My name is Rachel Smith. I'm a type 1 diabetic of 25 years, and today I'm going to be sharing my journey with medicine, sport, and mountaineering. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from Australia. I'm from Belfast in Northern Ireland, where I grew up and went to school. I then went to Queen's University Belfast, where I studied medicine and graduated as a doctor in 2021. I then moved to Scotland, where I've lived and worked for 2.5 years before making the move to Melbourne in January 2024, where I've been since, and I absolutely love it here. Sharing my story has been something that I've been interested in doing in some time, in the hope that I can inspire others to think big and chase their goals. Part of the reason that I'm taking on this challenge this year is definitely as a result of type 1 making me a stronger person. And as difficult and challenging as type 1 diabetes can be, I would love for everyone to come away from my talk today with perhaps a slightly different perspective in that type 1 can actually be our strength. So this December, I am undertaking my biggest challenge yet. I am going to Antarctica in the hope of becoming the first female living with type 1 to summit Mount Vinson, which is Antarctica's highest peak. This involves a 2-week expedition with exposure to average temperatures of minus 30 degrees Celsius, harsh winds, and technical terrain. Mount Vinson sits at 4,892 metres, which is twice the height of Mount Kosciuszko, Australia's highest peak, if anyone here has climbed that. And it has less than half of the total summits of Mount Everest, which I think just highlights how remote and untouched this part of the world actually is. By doing this climb, I'm going to be raising money for the incredible Breakthrough T1D, who have been so supportive of my journey this year, and it's been so lovely to be able to work with the team. So just briefly what I'm going to cover through the rest of my talk. I'm going to speak about my diagnosis and my experience growing up with type 1 diabetes, why I chose to study medicine, a little bit about sport and mountaineering, some mountaineering stories, and then finish with Mount Vinson and my mindset around all of the above. So since deciding to take on this challenge this year, I have spent quite a bit of time going back and speaking about the early days with my parents, because I don't have very many memories of this time. I was diagnosed in February 2000, which was just before my 3rd birthday, and I think I'm probably a little bit older than that in this photo, I can't really remember. I don't know what life is like without type 1, which I suppose, like all things, has its pros and its cons. I'm the oldest of 4 children, with my 2 younger brothers also being diagnosed in subsequent years, so type 1 diabetes is definitely not an uncommon theme in my house growing up. Throughout the first year of my diagnosis, I was on a very strict regimen called fixed daily injections, which isn't really used these days, but back then it was. And what this essentially meant was a fixed amount of insulin for a fixed amount of carbs at fixed times of the day. And for a child who's 3 years old, this was incredibly restrictive. Back then, we didn't have any of the technology that we rely on so heavily today, so every blood sugar was manual, and it wasn't uncommon to go for several hours without knowing what my blood sugars were doing. So much has changed over the last 25 years with regards to research and technology, and I consider it a privilege to have lived through so much of that and to have experienced firsthand the difference that that has made, not only to my day-to-day life, but also to my family's as well. So during this first year of my diagnosis, my parents are huge golf fans. They were watching the PGA Tour in America, and there was a famous golfer playing in the tour called Scott Verplank. And he was a type 1 diabetic and was noted to be using the insulin pump while he was playing in the tour. This prompted my parents to go and do a little bit more research on the pump and whether it would be a viable option for me, because it wasn't something that they had particularly heard of before. So they essentially gathered up what research there was and essentially brought forward a case to my paediatrician in my local hospital to ask whether I could be trialled on the insulin pump. I don't really think that that's how things work these days, but thankfully it did back then, because 1 year later then I became the first child in Northern Ireland to go on the insulin pump in 2001, which helped pave the way for type 1 diabetes management, especially amongst children in Northern Ireland. The insulin pump offered so much more flexibility, both to me and my family, especially as a child of that age. And yeah, it's made a huge difference, and I've been on it to this day. So I'm going to come on to speak a little bit about my experience growing up with type 1 diabetes, because I know there's a lot of children in the room and families of children. I feel like I had a very normal childhood growing up. I don't feel like I missed out on anything as a result of having type 1 diabetes. It would be naive to say that it didn't come without its challenges, navigating going to school, navigating sport, birthday parties, growing up with siblings and friends that don't have type 1. It definitely did have its ups and its downs, but my overwhelming feeling of my childhood is definitely a positive one, and I don't feel like anything is being particularly tainted because of type 1. My parents definitely ingrained the do your best approach rather than perfection. Perfection doesn't exist with anything, and it especially doesn't exist with type 1 diabetes. So I think this mindset from an early age definitely helped me to develop a more positive relationship with type 1, which I do think fed into my adolescent and adult life. And overall, I do feel like I'm at a pretty good place with it, despite, the odd day here and there. I do believe that having type 1 has helped shape who I am. Like I said, I don't know what life is like without it, but I do think it's hard to go through those additional adversities, challenges growing up and not come out that bit more stronger and resilient on the other side. So having type 1 diabetes has definitely influenced my decision to study medicine and become a doctor. Having had frequent exposure and encounters with the healthcare system from an early age, I definitely became very aware of what it felt like to feel seen and valued, and to know what to feel like the team in front of me genuinely cared about me and my condition. I wanted to make other people feel seen and valued, and especially at particularly vulnerable times in their lives. And to this day, this is still 100% one of the most rewarding parts of the job. I do absolutely love my job, and I do think there are a lot of transferable skills between working as a doctor, having type 1 diabetes, and also sport and mountaineering, having to adapt, problem solve ahead of time, work as a team, troubleshoot. I like to think that these 3 or 4 kind of key aspects of my life are actually quite intricately linked and benefit one another. So coming on to speak a little bit about sport. So I've been fortunate in that I've always been very active and always been involved in sport and always been supported to be involved in sport, which I know isn't always the case for everyone. There are a lot of barriers to engagement in sport, especially amongst children and teenagers. I'd say I got into competitive sport around 15 or 16, which at that time was primarily running. I'm a very competitive person and knew I always wanted to compete in sport. So I think that age was a bit of a watershed moment or a turning point for me with regards to managing my type 1 alongside sport, and essentially viewing them as one entity that had benefited one another and worked together, rather than these 2 separate things that I was trying to make work independently. And that kick-started, several years of trial and error, and which has kind of got me to where I am today. And I'm still far from perfect. I still have really tough days, and I think that's also just life. In the last 4 or 5 years, I have got to a point where I've been able to compete at a relatively high level. In the top left, this is me before one of several half marathons I've completed. The top right is at a CrossFit competition earlier this year in January. And the bottom photo is the High Rocks World Championships in 2023, when I had the privilege of being able to represent my country. I think it's really important to look back and see how far I've come with this, because there definitely was a point in my life where it would have felt quite far away and quite far-fetched. I'm just going to briefly touch on this breakthrough T1D study, which was actually conducted in the UK, and it essentially showed that more than 50% of people with type 1 felt held back from sport and exercise, primarily due to lack of support, fear of hypos, and stigma. To me, this is a very alarming statistic, especially as it's something that I'm extremely passionate about. And it is a statistic that I hope to change through this challenge, both through representation, but also through education, and something that I would love to be involved with going forward. So this feeds into my love of the mountains and how I got into the outdoors. I'm very fortunate back in Northern Ireland to have the local Mourne Mountains on my doorstep, only 45 minutes from my home. And to this day, is still one of the most beautiful places that I know. When I learned to drive at 17, I would quite often try and convince my friends to come to the mountains and spend our weekends there. But as you can imagine, most 17-year-olds don't want to do that. So it kind of essentially resulted in me spending quite a few days there on my own, but I absolutely loved it. There's a well-known challenge back home called the Mourne Wall Challenge, which essentially encompasses climbing 15 peaks in this particular mountain range, 35 kilometres, 22 miles. Most people choose to do it over a couple of days. I'm a bit crazy, so I tried to do it in one and succeeded. And then went back a few months later and did it the same thing overnight, just to challenge myself that bit more. And this is me just after sunrise on, I think, my first challenge. And I absolutely loved it. So from here, then went and climbed some of the highest mountains around the UK and Ireland, like Ben Nevis, Carrauntoohil. And yeah, just fell in love with it even more. So then this leads me on to my first experience of high altitude mountaineering, which was Kilimanjaro, which I summited when I was 19 in 2016. It feels like a long time ago now. For those of you who don't know, Kilimanjaro is the tallest mountain in Africa. It stands at 5,895 metres, and it takes approximately 7 to 10 days to climb. My group, I think, took 7 days, so this was 5.5 days up and 1.5 days down. Kilimanjaro is part of the wider Seven Summit Challenge, which is a well-known mountaineering challenge which encompasses climbing the highest mountains on each of the 7 continents. Mount Vinson in December is also one of them, and it will be my 4th of the 7. In 2016, this was before any CGMs in Northern Ireland, so I essentially did Kilimanjaro to the top and back completely with manual blood sugar readings, which right now seems pretty crazy considering I'm checking my phone like 10 times a day or more than that. I don't remember causing a huge amount of issues until the summit night. And you'll notice from the next few slides that summit nights are going to become a little bit of a theme because they're quite often the hardest or one of the hardest parts of these high altitude climbs. Quite often when we're summiting a big mountain, we will start walking just after midnight, 1 a.m., walk through the night with the aim of being at the summit for sunrise, both because it's beautiful, but also because it gives us the maximum amount of daylight hours to get back down safely. On this particular summit night, it was absolutely freezing, like minus 15, minus 20 degrees Celsius. I remember taking my glove off to try and test my blood sugar levels. My hands were so cold that I could barely draw any blood, and the blood that I did manage to draw froze before I managed to get a reading. So I think I maybe got 1 or 2 readings the whole way up to the summit, but it's okay. I made it in one piece. But I remember standing there and just taking it all in, and just it felt like very much like a calm euphoria, and I knew at that point that it wouldn't be my last experience at high altitude. I absolutely loved it. So from here, then I've had the privilege to be able to hike and mountaineer in some of the most beautiful parts in the world. So Nepal, Scotland, Norway, Switzerland, France, and then since I've been here, Australia and New Zealand. In the top left photo, this is me in the Scottish Highlands when I lived there. And the bottom left is on the summit of Lobuche, which is a 6,000 metre mountain in Nepal, close to Everest Base Camp. And I think this photo was taken just before sunrise on the summit night, so still an absolutely beautiful experience. So this leads me on to my most recent and probably my hardest expedition to date, other than obviously preparing for Vinson, which is Aconcagua. Aconcagua is in South America, and I did this mountain on the way to Australia, which I know geographically doesn't make sense, but it did in my head at that time. I sent off all of my bags to move to the other side of the world, expecting to meet them in Melbourne when I arrived. And obviously they were a few days late, so my first few days of moving to Melbourne encompassed me walking around in hiking boots with nowhere to live and starting a new job in a new hospital in less than a week. But yeah, we move. But Aconcagua, at just under 7,000 meters, is the tallest mountain in South America and the tallest mountain in the world outside of Asia. It takes 3 weeks to climb, and it is the most similar to 8,000 meter mountaineering, such as Everest, in the sense that we do rotations up and down the mountain, or we climb high and sleep low. What that essentially means is, we'll say, get to base camp. We'll do a rotation, we'll climb up to camp 1, maybe drop some gear, stay for a couple of hours, come back down to base camp, rest for a day or two. The next day we will then go up to maybe camp 2, sleep there, and then come back down. The purpose of this is that we acclimatise better, and this method of mountaineering isn't really needed or utilised. Kind of be up 7,000 metres and above is kind of where you need to do that. So it was a really good experience to know what that felt like for future expeditions. I'm going to touch on the mental aspect of this particular climb because, yeah, like I said, it was one of the most difficult things that I've definitely done, both physically but also from a type 1 point of view. Camp 3, which is the camp before the summit, is 6,000 metres, and the summit is just under 7,000 metres. So that is almost 1,000 metres of vertical ascent in extremely low oxygen environments. So at the summit of Aconcagua, there is 43% of the available oxygen that we are currently breathing. So as you can imagine, not the easiest thing in the world. Every step feels like a challenge, and kind of closer to the summit, it was quite often 2 or 3 steps and then stopping for 30 seconds to take a break. So with this huge physical challenge in front of me, with the complexities of having type 1 on top of that, I've spent quite a bit of time more retrospectively thinking about how I actually managed that and how I was able to get to the top safely and successfully while managing type 1. And how I did this was essentially, for like 15, 20 minutes, I would completely focus on the physical task ahead. And then I would have these 5 or 6 questions that I would essentially run through. Like, what are my blood sugars doing? How do I feel? Is it safe to stop and test my blood sugars? Is there someone nearby? I would kind of run through this checklist, and if I was happy with all of the answers, I would just kind of compartmentalize and move forward with the physical challenge ahead. If I wasn't happy with any of those answers, I would stop at the next safe spot and sort myself out before moving on. And I think this is something that is really important because the mental aspect without type 1 at this altitude is also extreme, even just from talking to other climbers without type 1. So I'm just going to touch on some of the things I've learned about managing type 1 diabetes at altitude. As you can imagine, this is not a particularly widely studied area of research, so a lot of this is anecdotal from either myself or also speaking to other climbers with type 1 who have done some other high altitude expeditions. I find in general, at lower altitudes, my blood sugars tend to run a little bit lower. At lower altitudes, we're quite often doing long days, so 8 to 10 hours back to back. And I feel like my body behaves similarly as it would at sea level, in the sense that it become quite insulin sensitive and require less insulin for a similar amount of carbs. So my blood sugars tend to run a little bit lower at lower altitudes, or I just need to drop my insulin requirements. As I go higher, so I kind of notice from 5,500 meters and above, my blood sugar readings tend to rise a little bit. One of the plausible explanations for this from the research that is out there is that the low oxygen environment places quite a lot of stress on our bodies, and our body's natural stress response is to release stress hormones, so adrenaline, noradrenaline, which drive our blood sugars up a little bit. And I definitely found this to be true for me. At those very high altitudes, having slightly higher blood sugars is a lot safer than having low blood sugars. So I just let myself kind of sit that bit higher for that 24-hour period and then fixed it when I came back down, because that was what helped me. Throughout all of these climbs, I've learned a huge amount about being able to trust my body and know when I need to just check in and take a minute to make sure that I'm safe to proceed. And it's been a huge learning experience, and there'll be a lot that I will take forward to my Mount Vinson preparation. The last point I'll touch on here is not to underestimate the post-expedition phase. So the effect of type 1 at altitude definitely didn't stop when I got back to sea level. I had about a 4-week period after Aconcagua where I was incredibly insulin sensitive. So, I say less than half of the insulin for carbs that I'd taken before. And very light exercise like walks or very slow jogs were causing me to drop when they hadn't done before. It definitely got to a point where I didn't know if it was going to end, but after about a 4-week period, it seemed to settle. I didn't expect that, and I didn't foresee that, so definitely another thing that I'm going to definitely take forward. So one of the questions I get asked most frequently is, how do I prepare for type 1, for managing type 1 on these high altitude expeditions? As we're probably all aware, keeping our insulin safe is at the forefront of our minds when when we're anywhere away from home, and that doesn't change on a high altitude expedition. How I keep my insulin safe is to compartmentalize it or put it into multiple of these Frio cases. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with them, but they essentially help to temperature regulate insulin and avoid either extreme heat or extreme cold. And I found them to be absolutely invaluable on all of my climbs. I will put these cases in my sleeping bag at night to avoid insulin from freezing. And when I'm going for summit pushes and it's minus 20 degrees or even colder, I'll make sure that they are in insulated pockets close to my chest to avoid freezing. Having plenty of backup supplies, so having a backup pump, backup insulin, backup infusion sets, hypo supplies, everything. On these climbs, you can never have too much extra stuff, so I just bring as much as I can fit into my bag, because you never know when anything's going to happen. Education, so educating both guides and other members of the team is hugely important. And I've been very fortunate on previous climbs that my guides have taken quite a bit of time, both ahead of and during the climb, to speak to me and educate themselves on signs and symptoms, and also learn how to use my technology on my phone should they need to. Thankfully they haven't, but it's a good peace of mind to know that they know how to use it. So I'm just going to come on and speak a little bit about Mount Vinson and why I'm taking on the challenge to become the first female living with type 1 to climb Antarctica's highest peak. And for me, this goes far beyond a personal challenge. I want to show the world what we can do. I want to redefine what's possible whilst living with type 1 by doing something that hasn't been done before. Type 1 is a huge part of who I am. It's a huge part of who we are. And I do strongly believe that I wouldn't be standing here about to take on this challenge if it wasn't for the additional skills, qualities, and strengths that I've gained as a result of having type 1 over the years. Prior to this year, speaking about both type 1 and mountaineering were topics that I actually held quite close to my chest and weren't things that I spoke about super publicly. But I decided this year that I wanted to change that because I believe so strongly in the message that I'm trying to get across, and I will want you all to be a part of this journey. I hope that by doing this climb that I will have the privilege of watching some of you do incredible things in the future because you genuinely believe that you could. I think we are some of the strongest, most resilient, incredible people that I've genuinely ever met. And I would love to be able to help shift the mindset from what can't I do because I have type 1 to what can I do because I have type 1. And just along the way to remember to be kind to ourselves, not be too hard on ourselves, and tomorrow is always a new day. So just briefly, just before I come on to the end of the talk and get some questions, an expedition like this isn't really possible without the help of sponsors and some additional help. So just briefly, just say a few words on the two sponsors I have at the minute. So the first one is Not Just a Patch, who are a Australian-based CGM patch company, who have been incredible, and I can honestly say I've not lost a sensor despite all of my training since I started using them. So definitely go and check them out. And the second one is Huel, which are a UK-based nutrition company who have been incredibly supportive and helping me to get the right nutrition for my climb this year. I am still looking for sponsors for this expedition, so if what I have said aligns with your values and you would like to be involved with this journey, please feel free to either come and have a chat with me after my talk, or I will leave my contact details on the next slide. Just a take-home message is to let type 1 be your strength.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that was such an inspirational and just amazing talk to hear about what you've already achieved and what you're hoping to achieve next. So thank you for sharing that with us. In that vein, I'll start with another, not a question, but an observation. You are such an inspiration and we welcome you to Australia. You have inspired me and many others. Thank you so much.
That's so nice. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, a couple of questions here. The first one is, what pump, insulin and CGM do you use? More details around the equipment would be great to learn about.
Yeah, of course. So when I got put on the pump in 2001, I was on the Medtronic pump, which I have used up until 2023, and I just used the Freestyle Libre 2 sensor at that point. When I was back in the UK, my diabetes team encouraged me to switch over to the Tandem and Dexcom, the MSL, for the closed loop purposes. So I have been using that since January 2024. Yeah, since then. So all my climbs have actually been with my Medtronic pump, but I'm planning to use my Tandem pump and Dexcom this year with the Control IQ technology.
Keep us posted and let us know
how that goes. I will indeed.
Another question around technology. Do you think that for people who are newly diagnosed with all of the technology available now, that's increased the fear around taking on big challenges alone and having to rely on that technology and your wits to get through challenges?
Yeah, maybe to an extent, but I think with the additional technology, I think what comes with that is just a huge amount more of information, which I suppose has its pros and its cons, but depends how you view it. But I think with that additional information, there's a lot of learning to be had. And I think overall it would be a benefit more than anything because you can use it to your advantage and it is incredible. And overall, I've actually found the technology to be very reliable at altitude, and I think it's really good.
Amazing. Speaking of high altitude and cold temperatures, have you ever had any frostbite?
Ooh, good question. I've got a bit of a dodgy toe on my left side from my Concagua.
So that's a yes.
So I wouldn't say frostbite, but yeah, it was a Concagua summit night. Was very cold. It was about minus 20 degrees, and I had a couple weeks where I was a bit nervous, but everything thankfully resolved.
Have you had to change your plans around the the gear that you're taking for your Antarctic trip based on what you learnt in your most recent one? Yeah,
for sure. So I learnt a lot in the last one, and not to cheap out on gear was definitely a huge learning point. You can get some incredible expedition gear at the minute, particularly with for feet and hands. Some of the up-to-date 8,000 meter boots have built-in battery warmers to help keep your feet warm. So I'm definitely investing in those this year because it's something that needs to be taken extremely seriously, especially with type 1.
Definitely. A couple more questions here. Do you feel like achieving your sporting and mountaineering goals with type 1 makes you feel even more accomplished than you would otherwise?
Yeah, 100%. I think when you get to the top of some of these mountains and you take a minute to reflect, well, I've taken a minute to reflect anyway on getting to the summit and what it's encompassed. There is a reasonable proportion of that challenge that actually has been attributed to type 1 and overcoming those additional challenges and complexities. So yeah, 100%. I think every single time I've got to the top of a mountain or even finished a race, I've been very aware that it has been that little bit harder from having type 1, and just taking a minute to reflect on that is actually quite nice and quite important, and it's something friends and family are very good at acknowledging as well, which is nice.
Yeah, all of the credit Absolutely. Okay, and our final question, a big one. What's next after Mount Vinson?
Ooh, the gold question. Well, this is obviously my 4th of the 7 summits, so potentially interested in ticking off a couple more of them. Maybe go to Europe next year, but I'm trying to just take it one thing at a time and go from there.
Maybe some smaller hikes.
Maybe some smaller hikes, yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, Rachel, thank you so much, and a big round of applause for everyone.
Thank you.